Welcome to Dark Whisper Society by horror author Dark Monarch. Enjoy the nightmare-filled stories for your bedtime. Be so kind and consider subscribing to Society. Hit the like button and check the links in the description box. Now let's start. Story 1. The Late Night Loop. Elias Vance lived by the calendar of the coast and the clock of the digital world, recording his small, self-produced podcast, The Late Night Loop, between midnight and 3 a.m. in the suffocating silence of his apartment. He was obsessive about audio quality, believing that the raw, unadorned voice was the ultimate secret currency of truth, and he meticulously ran spectral analysis on every raw track before mixing. This obsession was shattered by a flood of emails concerning episode 47, where listeners reported a faint, second voice layered beneath his speech, whispering blasphemies. At first, Elias dismissed it as phantom hearing or a technical glitch, but the reports intensified, becoming chillingly specific. A user pointed to the 32:15 mark of episode 49. You say, "We believe the entity is gone." The whisper says, driven by a cold knot of dread, Elias isolated the track, removed the compression, and boosted the low frequencies. His blood turned to ice as he confirmed the presence of a secondary audio track, a choked, wet, low-pitched sound that whispered, "Always here," precisely beneath his own words. He ripped off his headphones, realizing with profound terror that the mic was recording something that was not only present but impossibly close, yet utterly unseen. Elias spent the next 48 hours submerged in audio software, running complex noise reduction algorithms and filters, but the voice, which he dubbed the static, was impervious to removal, almost integrated with the harmonic structure of his own speech. The pattern of its appearances was worse than random. The static was not reacting to his words, but preceding them, speaking cruel inversions of his thoughts. When he muted his primary vocal track, the terrible truth was exposed. The static was perfectly synced not to his words, but to his respiratory cycle. It spoke every time he inhaled or exhaled. The physical evidence came from a retired sound engineer, Dr. Lenore Vance, who analyzed the track and concluded, "The frequency suggests it is being produced at a level below conscious human detection, likely through the pharyngeal or esophageal structures, not the vocal cords." The translation was devastating. You are producing the sound yourself. The static was not a ghost or a glitch, but his own darkest, most hostile subconscious given a sonic outlet by the hypersensitive microphone. The paranoia became systemic. Elias developed a raw, persistent tension in his throat, and when he tried to record again, the static surged violently, forcing him to realize that every time his body demanded air, he was breathing blasphemies. Isolation became absolute as he stopped recording, trying to achieve a state of pure, nonverbal silence. But the physical pressure behind his sternum intensified. He tried to purge the static by screaming pure chaos into the mic, hoping to overwhelm the parasite. But the playback revealed his scream was layered with the distinct, victorious laughter of the static, amplified by the very volume he used to fight it. He tried whispering prayers, only to find the sacred words twisted into monstrous, unintelligible syllables as the static sang along. Staring at the spectral view, Elias saw the chilling portrait of duality. His articulate conscious voice and the jagged, violent parasitic voice layered exactly at the base of the sound. He realized the possession wasn't supernatural, but a schism of the self, and the mic was simply giving voice to the hostile consciousness born of his isolation. Accepting his fate, Elias powered up the microphone one final time, the blue light glowing like a malignant eye, determined to expose the parasitic truth in episode 50, the final confession. His voice, hoarse and strained, spoke the required narrative. The truth is, my listeners were right. There's been a second voice on these recordings. It's the part of me that believes the worst things about the world and about myself. He took a deep, shuddering breath, and the cold pressure in his chest erupted. He didn't speak the final sentence with his conscious mind. The static spoke it, perfectly synced with his defeated exhale, clear and devastating. The voice is stronger now. The host is tired. Elias screamed, a raw sound of terror and surrender. But the mic captured the sound of his conscious scream being immediately overwhelmed and choked by a dense, prolonged, victorious laughter from the low-frequency static. The recording ended abruptly. Elias was found hours later, sitting at his desk, staring blankly at the screen. He was physically unharmed, but his mind was utterly changed, locked in catatonia. He never spoke again, perpetually shallow breathing, taking tiny minimal gasps of air as if terrified of fully inhaling. The final, recovered recording became digital folklore, analysts obsessing over the climax. When they isolated the low-frequency track, the static's final, chilling victory was clear. Beneath the sound of his tiny breaths was a continuous, uninterrupted, cold humming, a constant low-frequency monologue. The static had replaced the man entirely. The final, terrifying detail. The medical staff monitoring Elias's heart and lungs often reported a strange, deep, subsonic thump that accompanied every single shallow breath he took, a sound far too low to be human. The late-night loop had closed, and a voice in the static had finally found its permanent, quiet host. Story 2. Do Not Move It. Ana arrived in Zagreb in the merciless heat of August, desperate for space and silence. Her budget, however, dictated compromise, and compromise led her directly to the third floor of an old, heavy building near the railway tracks, a place where the humidity seemed to have settled into the very mortar. The apartment was cheap, the floors perpetually slanted, and the air smelled of stale tobacco and something cold and mineral, like unearthed stone. The landlord, a man named Mr. Tadic, was as stiff and unforgiving as the architecture. His introduction to the apartment was brief, punctuated by a single, peculiar warning delivered in a low, absolute tone. He pointed a thick finger at the centerpiece of the cramped bedroom, a colossal, dark walnut wardrobe. It was a monstrous piece of furniture, so massive it seemed less like an object and more like a permanent fixture of the room's geometry. "You may use everything," Mr. Tadic stated, his gaze fixed on Anna's face. "But you do not move the wardrobe. It stays against that wall. It must not be moved, not even an inch. Do you understand?" Anna, focused only on the incredibly low rent, simply nodded. "Of course. It looks too heavy anyway." "It is not the weight," Tadic replied, his eyes narrowing slightly before he turned and left, leaving the silence of the old apartment to swallow her whole. Anna managed one night of fitful sleep, her dreams thick with the image of the wardrobe, a huge, silent sentinel standing guard over the wall behind the head of her narrow, uncomfortable bed. By the second morning, the inconvenience outweighed the warning. The room was tiny, and the only sensible layout required the bed to be placed against the opposite wall to catch the light. The immense walnut wardrobe, Tadic's immovable object, was directly blocking the reorganization. Anna dismissed the warning as Balkan superstition or the peculiar demands of a grumpy old man. The wardrobe, old as it was, looked like it belonged in a museum, not cemented to the floor. Determined, she braced her back against the cool wood and shoved. It did not budge. She tried again, then enlisted the help of a neighbor, a muscular student named Marco, who laughed at the sheer, ridiculous size of the thing. Working together, Pushing and pulling until their muscles screamed, they managed to slide the wardrobe away from the wall by roughly 2 feet, leaving behind a profound, rectangular shadow on the discolored wallpaper. "Jesus," Marco grunted, wiping sweat from his brow. "What's in this thing, Bricks?" "Just old wood," Anna replied, relieved. "Thanks, you saved me." Marco left, and Anna set about moving the bed. As she dragged the mattress frame, her eyes drifted to the space the wardrobe had occupied. The wallpaper there was paler, untouched by decades of light and smoke. But centered on that pale rectangle, slightly lower than eye level, was a distinct, sickening anomaly. It was a stain, not a water stain, but a faint, diffuse outline, reaching from the floor up to her shoulder height. It was a shadow of charcoal and deep, iron red, the color of dried blood mixed with ash. It was the undeniable outline of a human body, pressed and permanently fixed into the plaster. The shape was not detailed, but the suggestion was absolute. A figure, kneeling or perhaps collapsed, permanently absorbed by the wall. A profound, terrifying coldness emanated from the spot, violating the stifling heat of the room. Anna stood paralyzed, staring at the stain. It was old, impossibly old, and she knew instantly why Tadic had demanded the wardrobe never move. It was the perfect concealment. The silence in the room became immense, filled only with the high-pitched ringing of her own internal panic. She spent the next hour frantically scrubbing the spot with soap and water, but the outline was not a surface mark. It was part of the wall itself, a permanent, terrifying scar etched into the building's memory. Exhausted and sickened, she managed to push the massive wardrobe roughly back into place, not daring to cover the entire stain, but positioning it so that the cold, dark wood stood sentinel over the burned-out space. The reorganization was complete, and the terror had begun. Sleep that night was a desperate, impossible battle against the knowledge of the wall. Anna lay rigidly, staring at the ceiling, trying to rationalize the stain as paint discoloration or an optical illusion caused by old moisture. She failed. The air in the room was thick and cold, a heavy counterpressure to the outside heat. At exactly 2 a.m., the first sound began. It was faint, but utterly clear in the silence. Footsteps, not creaking floorboards in the apartment above, but heavy, deliberate steps moving across the bare wood of her own room. The pattern was slow, dragging, and confined to an impossibly small, geometric area, the exact space Anna had created when she moved the wardrobe. The steps paced slowly from the wall, the body's final resting spot, to the edge of the bed, then back to the wall, and then forward again, a rhythmic, agonizing 4-step loop. Drag, scrape. Anna froze, her muscles seizing beneath the thin sheet. She squeezed her eyes shut, trying to convince herself it was an auditory hallucination. But the sound was too precise, too intimate, accompanied by the distinct, sickening sound of heavy breathing, a wet, ragged sigh that was impossibly close. The sound of the pacing was relentless, a cold, mechanical process being carried out in the dark space she had liberated for it. It was confined, deliberate, and terrifyingly present. She lasted another 20 minutes before seizing her phone and scrambling out of the room, fleeing into the relative safety of the cold kitchen. She waited until the first slivers of dawn painted the sky a bruised gray before returning to the bedroom. The air was clear and warm. The pacing was gone, and the huge, dark wardrobe stood motionless against the wall. But the coldness lingered, and on the wooden floor between the wardrobe and the bed, the faint, disturbed drag marks in the dust confirmed the haunting. Anna called Mr. Tadic immediately, demanding a confrontation. She met him in the bustling, oblivious square, far from the suffocating silence of the apartment. She told him about the outline, the cold, the footsteps. She watched his face, expecting denial or anger. She found only a deep, weary resignation. "I warned you about the wardrobe," Tadek said, his voice flat. "You defied the rule." "Who was that?" Anna demanded, her voice shaking. "The outline on the wall. Who was in that apartment?" Tadek sighed, his gaze drifting over the unaware crowd. "The last tenant, an old man, died in a fire, a bad electrical fire in the wall cavity. It sealed him there, pressed him right against the brick. He died on that spot, and you covered it up with a wardrobe." Anna cried, horrified. "He died there," Tadek conceded, "but the fire department log is wrong. He didn't leave. The apartment is still occupied, Anna. You're only sharing the time." The chilling indifference in his voice terrified her more than the revelation. He wasn't talking about a ghost. He was talking about an eternal, structural reality. Anna rushed back to the apartment, desperate to leave, but bound by her lease and her limited funds. She knew she couldn't stay, but she couldn't leave yet. That night, Anna tried to reclaim the apartment. She moved the bed into the living room, leaving the small bedroom empty, the vast, dark wardrobe standing alone with the scarred wall. She locked the bedroom door, wedging a chair beneath the handle, hoping to contain the horror. She lay rigid in the living room, the sounds of the city's late-night life filtering through the glass. She waited for the 2 a.m. cadence. The hour arrived, but the sounds did not come from the bedroom. They came from the hallway. Drag, scrape. The wardrobe was moving. The sound was immense, slow, agonizingly loud, metal and wood protesting against the floor. The chair beneath the doorknob groaned, then splintered with a sharp crack. The bedroom door swung slowly inward, revealing the colossal, dark silhouette of the wardrobe itself, dragged by an invisible force into the living room, now standing sentinel in the center of the floor. Anna stared, her scream caught in her throat. The wardrobe had come to her. It had brought the confined space, the ritualistic pacing, and the cold, mineral scent of the grave. The pacing began immediately, moving across the living room floor. Drag, scrape, drag, scrape. The confined loop of the deceased tenant had been violently expanded to her current location. The ragged breathing was closer than ever, moving from the wall, which was now the massive back of the wardrobe, to the foot of her bed. Anna was paralyzed by sheer, primal terror. She watched the dark, immense shape of the wardrobe standing guard. Then she saw it. A faint distortion in the air, a localized fluctuation of light, moving with the heavy, deliberate cadence of the footsteps. It was a visible cold spot, a shimmering of the atmosphere, moving closer, closer, closer to the edge of the bed. It reached the final mark, hovering over her feet. She squeezed her eyes shut, feeling a profound, agonizing coldness press down on her legs, the weight of a silent, permanent presence. The ragged breathing was right against her ear, accompanied by a cold whisper that was not a word, but a sound of final, deep resignation. He was tired of pacing alone. Anna did not open her eyes until the sun's light, real, warm, beautiful light, hit her face. She was still beneath the sheets, but the terror had drained her completely. The living room was empty. The immense, dark walnut wardrobe was gone. She crawled to the bedroom. The wardrobe was back in its original position, pushed tight against the wall, perfectly covering the faint, burned outline of the man who died there. The drag marks across the living room floor were subtle, but present. Anna grabbed her backpack and fled the apartment, leaving everything behind. Her clothes, her papers, her life. She found a distant coffee shop and called Mr. Tadek. "I'm breaking the lease," she said, her voice hollow. Tadek was silent for a long moment. "Did you move the wardrobe again, Anna?" "No," she lied. I can't stay. The deposit is non-refundable," Todek stated, his voice devoid of sympathy. "I warned you about the furniture. Some things, when they're finally settled, do not appreciate being disturbed. They find their way back to where they are comfortable." Anna never returned to the apartment. Years later, she would check the online rental listings for Zagreb, compelled by a lingering cold dread. The apartment was always listed cheap, available for new tenants, and prominently featured in every photograph of the tiny bedroom. Standing sentinel over the pale, scarred wall was the colossal, dark walnut wardrobe, waiting for the next person to defy the simple rule and create the necessary space for the silent tenant to pace his final, confined loop. The apartment was still occupied, and the wardrobe was still comfortable. Story 3. The Missing Hour. Ray Kincaid lived his life in increments of diesel consumption, road signs, and the uncompromising rhythm of the digital clock on his dashboard. For 15 years, the cab of his Peterbilt, affectionately named the Iron Saint, had been his world, a sanctuary of motion and predictable logic, hauling refrigerated freight across the silent, endless tapestry of the American Southwest. Tonight, he was pushing across a particularly desolate stretch of Texas backroads, somewhere west of US 281, heading toward the early morning cool of Sonora. The cab was quiet, save for the low thrum of the engine and the faint, hypnotic glow of the dash lights. He glanced habitually at the clock, a cheap, red digital readout mounted above the navigation screen. It read 1:14 a.m. He ran a quick calculation. 3 more hours to the first major stop, 400 miles left in the haul. He reached for his thermos, his mind already drifting into the smooth, methodical space that defined his existence on the road. The jump was not a flicker, a stutter, or a slow drift. It was a single, clean, brutal substitution. Ray's hand was halfway to the thermos when the numbers on the clock snapped. The red digits, which had just read 1:14 a.m., instantly became 2:14 a.m. It was a full, clean, minute-for-minute leap. 60 minutes of his life, annihilated in the space of half a second. Ray froze, his knuckles white against the steering wheel. The truck was still moving at 75 miles per hour, the headlights still cutting through the darkness, the radio still playing the same muted country song. Nothing had changed, yet everything had. Electrical surge. He immediately rationalized, his mind scrambling for the nearest technical excuse. Maybe the battery is glitching. He reached over and physically reset the clock, holding down the button until the digits returned to 1:14 a.m. He drove for 10 more minutes, his anxiety suppressed beneath a rigid layer of professional denial. He checked the time again, 1:24 a.m. Everything was normal. He just hit a rough patch of road, jarring the cheap electronics. Problem solved. He drove on, the silence of the cab now heavy and strained, filled with a cold, internal dread that defied the simple explanation. He felt a profound, psychic exhaustion, a deep, bone-weary fatigue that had not been present 30 minutes ago. He should have felt refreshed. Instead, he felt wrung out, as if he'd wrestled with something immense and invisible in the space of that missing hour. He didn't check the clock again for another 40 minutes, until the low-fuel light pinged an alert. He pulled his eyes from the empty road and glanced at the dashboard. The clock read 3:05 a.m. The time should have been closer to 2:05 a.m. The clock hadn't just continued from the 1:14 jump. It had done it again, exactly 1 hour later. Ray's hands were shaking violently now. 2 clean hours of his life were gone, excised from his personal timeline with the cold, absolute precision of a scalpel. He pulled the Iron Saint over onto the dirt shoulder, cutting the engine. The immense silence that followed was suffocating. He sat for 10 minutes, his mind a battlefield of denial and rising panic. He didn't feel confused about where he was. He was confused about who he was. He felt profoundly violated, as if the integrity of his own subjective existence had been breached. He slowly, methodically climbed out of the cab. He needed air, the cold, dry reality of the Texas night against his skin. As he stood beside the massive truck, forcing himself to breathe, a cold sensation traced itself across his left forearm. He looked down. Centered on the underside of his forearm, just above the wrist pulse, was a fresh, stark triangular scar. It was small, no bigger than a thumbnail, its edges perfectly symmetrical and unnaturally white against the flushed red of his skin. It looked like it had been there for weeks, yet the edges were raw and sensitive. Ray ran his finger over the mark. It wasn't a scratch or a scrape. It was a deliberate, precise incision, healed instantly, a physical receipt for the 2 hours he couldn't account for. The realization of the time jump, the exhaustion, and the scar slammed together, forming a horrifying, cohesive whole. This wasn't a glitch. This was a seizure. He scrambled back into the cab, locking the door. His heart hammered against his ribs. He immediately accessed the internal memory of his dash cam, a high-definition system he ran continuously for insurance purposes. He had to know what the Iron Saint had witnessed. He scrolled back to the first jump, the 1:14 a.m. mark. He watched the footage, his breath held tight in his chest. The road ahead was empty, the center line stretching endlessly into the darkness. The footage was smooth, continuous, and clear. Then, the second before the dash clock would have read 1:14 a.m., the screen did something impossible. The smooth, flowing video snapped into a single, blinding, instantaneous frame of pure, undifferentiated white light. It was absolute, immediate, and overwhelming. The single frame consumed the road, the truck, and the night. Then, in the very next frame, the scene returned to normal, the road reappeared, and the clock on the dash read 2:14 a.m. The visual evidence was worse than any fantasy he could have imagined. The world hadn't glitched, it had been overwritten. He found a second jump, the 2:14 a.m. mark that skipped to 3:14 a.m. The pattern was repeated with sickening accuracy. The second before the clock was due to advance, a single, terrifying frame of absolute white light, followed by the next hour. The time was gone, replaced by a visual erasure, a blinding moment of non-existence captured on a digital loop. Ray spent the rest of the pre-dawn hours huddled in the cab, driving on pure adrenaline, the triangular scar on his arm pulsing with a cold ache. He ignored the cargo. He ignored the clock, which he had now completely turned off. His focus was entirely on the dash cam footage, playing the single, horrifying white frame over and over again, trying to find a flicker, a shadow, a distortion, any flaw in the total visual erasure. There was none. It was a perfect, blinding void. He knew what the world would call this, abduction, but the term felt flimsy and insufficient against the cold, clinical reality of the dash cam evidence. He hadn't been pulled into a chaotic space. He had been pulled into a perfect, controlled silence, a void so complete it erased the light itself. He delivered the cargo hours late, offering a vague story about brake trouble and exhaustion. He immediately rented a cheap, isolated room, ignoring his dispatcher's frantic calls. He plugged the dashcam drive into his laptop, running sophisticated forensic analysis on the corrupted frames. He slowed the video to microseconds, seeking the slightest digital disturbance. He found it, buried deep in the metadata of the two corrupted frames. The system log for those 2 moments did not register a simple loss of signal. The sensor log, which measured the physical light hitting the lens, recorded an unquantifiable increase in luminosity, a light so intense it went beyond the camera's ability to categorize color or texture, forcing the entire frame into absolute, blinding white. The road hadn't vanished. It had been overexposed to infinity. Ray stared at his laptop screen, the cold, analytical truth piercing his mind. The missing time wasn't darkness. It was too much light. Something had reached into his life, claimed 2 hours of his consciousness, left a scar as proof, and blinded the world for a single, perfect frame to ensure its privacy. He looked down at the triangle on his forearm, now red and angry. He was no longer worried about the missing time. He was terrified of the next time the light would come, and what final, cold purpose the architects of that perfect white silence would have for the man who saw the unseeable gap in the world. He was waiting for the blinding frame to reappear, knowing the clock was ticking toward the next scheduled, terrifying silence. Story 4. The Wrong Voice. The logging road ended abruptly in a marshy clearing choked with black spruce and the silence of absolute isolation. 4 friends, Liam, the meticulous planner, Chloe, the nervous skeptic, Ben, the easygoing anchor, and Mark, the volatile, charismatic gearhead, had driven 8 hours north of Duluth to reach this exact, forgotten spot just shy of the U.S.-Canadian border. Their phones, predictably, registered only the cold, unyielding 0 of no service, a fact Liam had marked as essential to the trip's purpose, a clean, pure break from the world. The evening was perfect for the myth they were chasing, the deep, primordial quiet that clings to the borderlands. The air was thick with the scent of pine needle decay and damp earth. Their fire crackled lazily, casting a warm, deceptive circle of light against the encroaching, heavy darkness. Ben, the center of their calm, was meticulously carving a piece of wood near the fire's edge, occasionally tossing a dry stick into the flames. It was just past midnight when the first sound cut through the stillness. It wasn't a snap of a twig or a howl of a wolf. It was a voice, clear, immediate, and utterly heartbreaking in its terror, calling from the thick, unyielding darkness 50 yards beyond the reach of the firelight. "Help! Get me out of here!" The voice was high-pitched, choked, ragged with panic, and undeniably Mark's. Liam, Chloe, and Ben froze, their heads snapping toward the black wall of trees. Mark, who had been leaning against a rusted truck fender, sipping coffee, dropped his cup. The metal clang echoed in the sudden, panicked silence. "What the hell?" Mark whispered, his face pale in the firelight. Chloe's eyes were wide, scanning the darkness. "Was that you?" Mark shook his head, his face a mask of primal confusion and fear. "No, that wasn't me. That was my voice." Before any of them could move, the voice came again, closer this time, moving with frightening speed through the dense undergrowth, but still hidden by the shadows. The sound was a flawless, agonizing mimicry of Mark's unique cadence. The slight whistle on the S, the raw, desperate edge in his high tenor when stressed. "Help! Get me out of here!" Then the anchor stood up, dropping his carving knife. "Mark, stay right there. That's a trick." Chloe grabbed the flashlight. "I am right here," Mark yelled, pushing away from the fender, his hand shaking. "It's right there in the trees." "That's me." The paradox was physically paralyzing. The terror was not merely in the call for help, but in the absolute, undeniable fidelity of the sound. It was the subjective, specific voice of the man sitting terrified among them, projecting from a source that could not exist. Liam, forcing his logic to fight the panic, grabbed the heavy beam flashlight and pointed it at the treeling. The beam cut a tight, defined path through the darkness. Nothing, only the thick, heavy shadows and the impenetrable lattice of spruce. The sound came a third time, startlingly close now, right at the edge of the light. It was still Mark's voice, but the terror was higher, more frantic, laced with a new, agonizing desperation. "Help! Get me out of here! Stay back!" Liam yelled into the trees, his voice breaking. "Don't go out there!" Chloe screamed, pulling on Ben's arm. Mark was trembling, his eyes fixed on the source of the sound, a horrified realization dawning on his face. "It knows my voice. It knows the sound of me." Ben, holding Chloe tightly, shouted toward the hidden voice. "We hear you. Where are you hurt?" The voice did not answer the question. It simply repeated the agonizing 3-second phrase that was now etched into their souls, word for word, syllable for syllable, inflection for inflection. "Help! Get me out of here!" The repetition was worse than the original call. The mimicry was perfect, absolute, a sound manufactured with cold, technical precision, devoid of any genuine, spontaneous human distress. It was a sound recording of agony, played on a continuous loop. They waited, paralyzed, the only noise the rapid, shallow breathing of the 4 people huddled around the small fire. The air was now cold, filled with the scent of ozone and the heavy dread of violation. The voice came a 5th time. "Help! Get me out of here! It's not real!" Chloe whimpered, burying her face against Ben's chest. "It's a machine. It's a recorder." Mark shook his head, his eyes burning with fear. "No! Listen to the inflection. The break in the 3rd word, me. It's not looped. It's being said again. It's repeating the words, but it's re-saying them." The difference was subtle but devastating. A loop is static. This was an active, malevolent repetition, an entity focusing its consciousness on recreating the sound of Mark's most primal terror, honing its craft with each utterance. The voice came again, the flawless mimicry now terrifyingly intimate. "Help! Get me out of here!" Liam, the meticulous planner, tried to introduce a chaotic element, yelling a question at the real Mark. "Mark, what was the last thing you ate?" The voice from the trees ignored the question. It delivered the only phrase it knew, now with a subtly deeper resonance, a sound that seemed to vibrate from the very roots of the trees. "Help! Get me out of here!" The repetition continued, relentless, cold, and consuming. 10 times, 12 times. The sound began to erode their sanity, the agonizing cry of their friend, who was sitting right beside them, proving that the world held horrors that transcended physical presence. The voice was a parasitic sound, wearing the identity of Mark's despair. The horror reached its climax on the 15th repetition. "Help! Get me out of here!" But this time, the phrase was not followed by silence. It was immediately followed by a sound that tore through the night's stillness, a sound that was pure, cold, unadulterated laughter. It was a full, rich, resonant human laugh, a sound of immense, predatory pleasure. But it was not Mark's laugh. It was delivered in the perfect pitch and cadence of Mark's voice, a flawless auditory reproduction that contained zero joy, only malevolent, conscious victory. The sound was sustained for 4 full, agonizing seconds, a deep, resonant chuckle that seemed to mock the limits of human identity, proving that the mimic sound of agony was now a source of amusement. The 4 friends scrambled away from the fire, screaming. They didn't run into the trees where the sound originated. They ran deeper into the clearing, clinging to the only light source remaining, the faint, flickering, fragile light of the dying campfire. They ran from the terrifying, impossible laughter of ghosts that had stolen their friend's sound, and then worn it to celebrate its success. The silence that followed was absolute, filled only with the knowledge that the woods now held a hunter who knew the true, vulnerable sound of their deepest terror. Story 5. The House. The property listing for 412 Glimmerwood Lane was suspiciously brief. Unique country home. Private. Architectural interest. For Elias and Clara Thorne. Escaping the suffocating press of the city for the quiet solitude of rural life. Unique sounded like charm, and cheap sounded like necessity. They drove 200 miles north of the city until the phone service vanished, and the roads narrowed into gravel paths bordered by silent, ancient pines. The house itself was a sprawling, low-slung structure built of field stone and dark, heavy timber, settled into a hollow like an immense, petrified animal. The moment Elias stepped out of the car, he noticed the first unsettling architectural oddity. The house was a quadrangle built around a recessed central courtyard that was covered by a glass canopy, a sort of internal atrium. The external walls were massive, monolithic, and almost windowless, but the internal walls, the ones facing the courtyard, were almost entirely composed of glass. "It's like a fortress," Clara murmured, tilting her head. "It keeps the world out, but lets the light in." Elias nodded, but the impression was wrong. The windows were not about letting light in. They were positioned, aligned, and angled to look at the central living spaces. The entire house was designed to be observed from the inside out, but the true spectacle was the interior itself. The great room, the kitchen, the hallway, all the places they would live, were permanently visible to the glass-lined perimeter of the internal structure. It wasn't designed for a family. It was designed for a viewer. They unpacked over 2 days, the silence of the countryside amplified by the heavy stone structure. The central room, the heart of the home, was a vast, sunken space beneath the glass canopy. They found themselves constantly aware of the peripheral glass walls surrounding them, the dozens of large, empty rectangles of glass facing inward from the surrounding corridor. Even in the dead of day, when the sun streamed in, the light felt less like illumination and more like a high-powered spotlight. The true paranoia began on the third night. Elias had gone to bed, but Clara was still downstairs, reading by the low, warm glow of a floor lamp in the sunken living room. She felt a chill, a sudden, profound drop in the temperature that had nothing to do with the outside air. She looked up slowly, scanning the perimeter of glass walls lining the corridor above. The windows were dark, reflecting the lamp and the interior furniture in glossy, black rectangles. But in the second window from the left, she saw it, the silhouette of a figure. It was faint, dark, and utterly motionless, standing just inside the perimeter, staring directly down into the living room. Clara froze, her breath catching in her throat. Her first thought was an intruder, but the interior corridor was locked and empty. There were no lights on in the surrounding rooms. The house was shut down for the night. The figure, tall, slender, and distinctly human, should have been an impossible reflection of some internal object, but she scanned the room frantically. Nothing in the room matched the height or the outline of the figure. She stood up, her movement slow and deliberate, and stared back. The silhouette did not move. It was perfect, absolute shadow against the interior blackness of the glass, the faint shape of a human observing her. The sense of being watched was immense, crushing, and deeply personal. Clara screamed, seizing the nearest object, a heavy brass lamp, and lunged toward the window. The moment she moved, the silhouette vanished. It didn't step back or duck. It was simply gone, erased from the glass, leaving only the pristine black reflection of the empty, quiet room. Elias found her trembling in the center of the room, still holding the lamp. He checked every door, every window, every room in the house. Everything was sealed, locked, and silent. He tried to rationalize it. A trick of the light, a reflection of a tree through the glass ceiling, a fatigue-induced hallucination. But the cold, physical dread in the room defied his logic. The sightings became an agonizing, repetitive ritual. They occurred only at night, only when they were stationary and always focused on the living room. Elias saw them next, two distinct silhouettes standing side by side in the kitchen window facing the central space, their presence a cold, undeniable fact in the dark reflection. The moment he reached for a light switch, they dissolved. The chilling, uniform design of the house was the mechanism of the horror. It forced them to live in a state of perpetual, internal exposure, constantly aware of the dozens of empty eyes aimed at their vulnerable center. Elias finally called the previous owner, an elderly man named Mr. Volkov, using a neighbor's landline. Volkov was unervingly calm when Elias described the inward-facing windows and the silhouettes. "Ah, the watcher windows," Volkov said, his voice dry and distant. "You moved the house to its next stage, Mr. Thorne. I warned you about the house. I was warned about the septic tank, not the windows." Elias snapped, desperate for an answer. "What is this? Who built this thing?" "An architect named Alton. He believed the ultimate beauty was not a house that housed a family, but a house that contained a consciousness," Volkov explained. He theorized that a structure, built correctly, could become sentient. He designed the windows to face inward toward the heart of the home, so the house could watch the messy, chaotic truth of human life. "The windows are not windows, Mr. Thorne. They are its eyes." Elias felt the bottom drop out of his stomach. "And the silhouettes? The people we see watching us." Volkov sighed, a heavy sound of ancient resignation. "Those aren't people, Mr. Thorne. The house is alive, and it needs a way to process the chaos it sees. It needs a shape to hold the act of observation. The silhouettes you see are the house's pupils, the focal points of its gaze, which it forms in the glass when its attention is fully fixed on the life it contains. It's watching you, Mr. Thorne, and the longer you live there, the clearer its sight will become." Volkov hung up, leaving Elias alone with the cold truth. He looked out the window at the dense pines, now realizing the vast, quiet structure was not a haven, but a silent, consuming sentience. That night, Elias and Clara refused to light the living room. They sat in absolute darkness, huddled on the sofa, covered by a blanket, trying to eliminate the source of the house's visual fascination. The strategy failed instantly. The darkness didn't deter the house. It merely deepened the silence of its gaze. Elias, terrified, watched the black, glassy perimeter of the walls. Instead of faint shadows, the house created its pupils from the deepest blackness of the night. They were not faint silhouettes. There were dozens of them, perfectly formed, motionless human shapes filling every single window facing the living room. They were darker than the surrounding night, darker than the pitch black of the window frames, radiating an intense, cold vacuum. The house wasn't just watching them. It was absorbing the light to create a focused, omnipresent gaze. Clara whimpered, pointing to the closest window, the one facing their sofa. Elias looked where she pointed. The silhouette in that pane was not an impersonal shape. It had begun to show detail. He could distinguish the faint, horrible outline of a face, eyes wide and fixed, staring directly at them. The eyes were twin, pale, unblinking discs, utterly colorless against the consuming blackness of the figure. And then, the silhouette raised its hand. It wasn't a threatening gesture, but a slow, deliberate movement of acknowledgement, a cold, horrifying wave of welcome from a consciousness that had finally achieved perfect, absolute focus on the beautiful, messy chaos of their fear. The house was no longer simply watching them. It had recognized them. Elias knew the house was not satisfied with the simple act of observation. The house needed to catalog, to classify, to understand the unique structural chaos of its new inhabitants. He realized that the ultimate horror was not the silhouettes in the glass, but the inevitable, terrifying certainty that the house would soon reach its next stage of comprehension. It would begin to mimic what it saw, projecting its newfound understanding of human life back into the glass in horrifying, personalized detail. They were trapped in the perfect viewing cage, and the eternal, cold audience was finally awake. Thank you for listening. I hope you have enjoyed the stories. Before you leave, do subscribe and like. It's a small click for you, but huge help for the channel. Thanks. I will see you soon. Until then, have a great nightmares.